Welcome to Living Outside the Matrix, the Truth Seekers show where we examine important issues that are either ignored or misrepresented in the mainstream narrative. Hi there, I'm your host, Nigel Howett, and on the show today, it's a great pleasure to welcome back Dr. Zach Bush, MD, the triple board certified medical doctor from the USA with specialization in internal medicine, endocrinology, and hospice care. And he's also an internationally recognized educator on the microbiome as it relates to human health. Dr. Zach, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and a very warm welcome to the show.
I'm thrilled to be here. Appreciate you having me on here.
Perhaps we could start by just picking up the thread on glyphosate. We've talked about this ubiquitous toxin before and its threats to the human health, both directly and indirectly. It's been said that there might be an oxidant that could break it down, chlorine dioxide. Do you know of any evidence that proves or disproves that sort of idea?
Certainly, the concept is solid. It has not been proven to break it down in human systems, to my knowledge, but the concept is sound in that if you take any potent oxidant, anything from an acid down to something like hydrogen peroxide, or in this case, it's the chlorine that's released from the chemical you described there. And so as you get that oxidative injury to a molecular structure, you can disrupt it. And in the case of glyphosate, you're trying to disrupt charges between a phosphate group and the amine, which is the amino acid kind of backbone of this chemical. Amino acid is an important building block for protein. The phosphate and a carboxyl group on the other side make that a chemical that's a water-soluble toxin, man-made, doesn't occur in nature. And so you're trying to break up that chemical. So if you've got a severe enough oxidative molecule, you can damage that directly. The approach we take is a much more gentle approach because we think that oxidation actually has a cumulative effect in the body that's not getting at the root cause of the situation. And so we take the approach instead of at the microbial level, we're going after microbial digestion of those molecules. And we know that happens in soil. We know that can happen in the human gut. We have clinical trial looking at supporting microbial diversification with soil compounds to break that product down. And so we see a drop in glyphosate, but at the same time you're seeing an upregulation of antioxidants and lysine, which is a critical amino acid for immune system function. And so we find that the microbial world has solutions for every toxin that we've ever made. Because the microbial world developed within the context of the periodic chart. And so everything on the periodic chart, from your noxious acids with hydrogen all the way at your first element, all the way to the heavy isotopes of radioactive material. Pseudomonas, for example, is a very good detox mechanism for radioactive isotopes of uranium and things like this. So fascinating that the microbiome has developed niches. So rather than looking for yet another chemical to disrupt our chemicals, I think we need to increasingly look to the nature itself around us, so the microbiome and our reconnection with it, to not just detox glyphosate, but to detox our own intracellular environment. We make toxins all the time in digestion of food and materials, and we need those cleared as well. And so for all of that to soup to kind of clear itself and clean itself and train to correct itself, we look to that microbial foundation.
So just sort of summarize there, you would say essentially that it's more the diversity of the gut microbiome rather than necessarily any benefit. Obviously the oxidization potential of chlorine dioxide, as you mentioned, could have some use, but a better approach, you're saying, to deal with glyphosate would be to work more on gut diversity.
That's right. And one of the problems with chlorine dioxide is obviously around its own nature as a sterilizing agent. And so if you're taking that orally, it's the same chemical that's used to chlorinate pools. So you take chlorine dioxide, you dump it into water, and it turns into this potent, sterilizing compound. And so when you're sterilizing the human gut, you're running into the exact same problem that you would with an antibiotic or a probiotic. Any of these compounds that are limiting the biodiversification of your gut is going to be detrimental over the long run. So if you're going to take something like chlorine dioxide, you need to think of that as an antibiotic. You need to think of that as a compound that, okay, if you're going to take that, take it for a short period of time and then let your gut recover, because you don't want to be sterilizing the gut.
So there would be little point in working on that sort of hypothesis that you said is reasonable, that as an oxidizing agent it might have some effect. There would be more counterproductive effects going on, so it wouldn't be worth considering as any part of a detox program to get rid of glyphosate specifically.
Yeah, I think that's very accurate. I think that's spot on, and I think that nature never does a single chemical. It abhors that kind of simplicity. It does not like monoculture. It does not like the opposite of diversity, and so I look at something like that chemical and think, okay, that's a pharmaceutical approach to changing the terrain, and sometimes maybe that's an appropriate maneuver. I think, if you're faced with, an overwhelming parasite infestation of the gut or something like that, because you were exposed to contaminated fecal waters and things like this, like there, I could see a necessity for doing suffering a gut injury in the short run to reset the terrain. But you really have to, quickly move back to where you're thinking about biodiversification rather than destruction.
People have been questioning whether or not there's any use, obviously in the context of this COVID-19 declared pandemic. People were wondering whether, given its oxidizing potential, whether it would be any use against pathogens, viruses, and that sort of thing. Any particular comments on that?
To protect yourself from any microbe, bacteria, fungi, parasite, you want lots of diversity, and the nature itself in its diversity is the immune system. There is no human immune system. Our immunity is the relationship between the outside world and us, and without that connection and integration into that complex system, we get very confused with the immune system very quickly. We develop autoimmune conditions, we develop cancer, we develop this massive confusion internally when we are separated from the biology in which we developed. And so my concern about chlorine dioxide going out there is like this thing is people start taking it preventatively. That's a nightmare. Like, that's the opposite of what you want to do. You don't want a sterilizing compound in your gut at the moment that you might be forced to deal with a transition in the terrain as the genome shifts with viruses. Viruses are not living beings. I don't count them as the microbiome. They're the way the microbiome communicates genetically with our cells and back and forth. We communicate with our microbiome through our genetic exudation of what we call exosomes, but are really the same thing as viruses. So we're genetically communicating through viral transport, and we need an update from that. But nobody dies from viruses. People die from downstream effects of the immune system not being able to tolerate those shifts in the terrain because we're so disconnected. And so I would emphasize to your group, do not take something like a sterilizing agent, like the president mentioned, maybe we could shoot disinfectants into the veins and things like that. That's like the opposite of what we want to do, but it's exactly what we are doing. We've got Italy spraying the Alps with these toxic chemicals to try to sterilize COVID. That's why COVID is there, is because we so disbalance, created so much disharmony and imbalance and, destruction of the microbiome's diversity. And so we keep thinking these are the threats when we are the threat. It's our behavior that's creating the vulnerability of death, not the virus.
It seems that it could be very counterproductive with a lockdown scenario where people who may be less fortunate with access to outdoors might be sort of indoors a lot of the time at the moment, not availing themselves to that broadness of microbiome diversity as you've talked about in the past. Maybe this relates into something else I was going to ask you. How does that sort of help? It's not helping our health being locked inside. How does that affect the sort of the theoretical isolation lockdown to reduce ultimately deaths and suffering and any sort of infectious numbers of cases and stuff, versus just letting a virus run riot and run its course?
Yeah, so there's a mistake that we've made, which is understandable because we've been, for the last 100 years, we've really believed strongly in the germ theory. We really thought that germs were attacking humans, and not all of us. I mean, there was a huge academic, even 150 years ago, 1870s, 1880s, you have Beauchamp, or Beauchamp, as they say in the French there. The Beauchamp and Pasteur were the two guys who were going back and forth. Pasteur arguing that germs were causing all this disease. Beauchamp with some brilliant science in doing twin studies showing that if you change the environment, the twins were either susceptible or resistant to completely different situations or pathogens. So he really proved out as early as the 1880s that the germ theory was incomplete, if not completely wrong. And but unfortunately, he lost to Pasteur, and that's where we developed the term pasteurization. So now we pasteurize all of our food. We try to get all the bacteria out of there, not realizing that we're creating this massive damage to the very terrain of human biology. And so but even if germ theory is right in the realm of bacteria, fungi, and the like, which again is very questionable. But even if it is, then we made a much bigger and more grave mistake when we then attributed that to viruses. Viruses are much different, non-living organisms.
Yeah. Is there any merit in the metaphor of sort of the game rock, paper, scissors? I think you've discussed previously that, viruses will go for fungi and bacteria will go for, in this sort of equalizing game of everybody against everybody else in some respects. Is there um, is there any evidence there that suggests that viruses ultimately are on they're not a problem to us at all? As you said, is it all um, a sort of a misunderstanding, an incorrect paradigm to work from?
So the question in being around terrain and the current virus, the concept that this virus is marching across the world as this tyrant of against health is very mistaken. It's a very old story, again, mistaken for this kind of germ theory being applied to the viruses. But in reality, the virus is just a genetic update to the global microbiome. There's discussion of, well, maybe this is made in a military lab, or all these stories coming out. And even if it was, it was never made in a lab. This is a natural compound. A coronavirus goes back to billion years. It so predates our human experience that to say that we make anything in the lab is very inaccurate. We may be able to modify these things slightly, and maybe to harm we modify these things. We've certainly proven we can do that in labs. We can make Ebola be able to infect human cells when it didn't originally be able to do that, and things like that. So we can definitely screw things up. I think we have a huge track record for doing that as humans. We pretty much make toxic anything we touch. We have a tendency to kill anything that we interact with that's non-human. We have this belief that somehow we're separate from nature and we need to kill nature, or it's going to kill us. That's not how we developed. We are literally a piece of biology that developed over 1.5 billion years. We've only been here 200,000 years on an almost 2 billion year old planet. And so we have this massive, philosophical mistake in our thinking. And the viruses, I think, are our pathway scientifically to prove that we're just completely wrong about everything. The viruses are the method by which the planet distributes genetic information around the world to adapt to climate change, to new threats to the ecosystem, new population changes. That's how we find out about these things. This is how we adapt as species to a changing planet. Our planet has been morphing and changing since its origin. This is how it adapts. This is how it allows biology to adapt to the changes. We happen to be the cataclysmic event that's happening on the planet right now. Our behavior is the catastrophic injury driving the sixth extinction. The previous 5 extinctions were from things like asteroids, massive volcanic events, massive dumping of sulfuric acids from the core of the earth up into the oceans. Like these catastrophic injuries reset biology multiple times, and we are now the catastrophic injury to the planet, and we are either going to continue that and go extinct with 87 to 97% of life that we'll take with us, and then the earth will reset again and biodiversity will happen again because of the viruses. The viruses are what allow biodiversity to happen. They are not germs. They actually are absorbed into our cells, and then we produce them at a higher level to get that information out with our own adaptations built in.
Yeah. So you mentioned that the viruses are helping us actually communicate. They're a means of genetic material moving around the planet effectively. What about exosomes and their alleged role? Is there any overlap here? Are viruses exosomes, exosomes viruses? And does this have implications on whether or not a particular set of symptoms, when it's associated with a particular disease, the lack of proven causality? How do exosomes muddy the waters when you talk about viruses being this RNA DNA communication system? Is that getting into exosome theory territory?
Yes, it is the same thing. John Gilday, PhD from Johns Hopkins, background in genomics, is our chief science advisor at our laboratory. He was the very first publication on exosomes showing the capacity to transfer genetic information into other cells. And so human exosomes, he proved, could change renal tubules in other species and such. So he's the very first guy to kind of like break this news a few years back. And so he and I, are talking every week, obviously, since this whole outbreak, around, the opportunity that we have to re-educate the population. So, around this subject of we are the machinery by which this genetic information moves out there. We're told, oh, it came from a bat or it came, whatever. No, it didn't. We produce them. We may get information genetically that we share with bats and things like that, but we're the machinery that makes every virus that will go and spread to humans. We are the machinery for that. The bats aren't in close enough and mass volume enough to cause a global pandemic. We have to produce that. And so we are the production center for this genetic material. An exosome is material that we're producing every second, and most of it is in the form of microRNA, which doesn't go on to make proteins, but then shapes the behavior of other genes that do make proteins. A very small percentage of our genome, 1.5%, actually makes genes. The other 98.5% is previously categorized as junk DNA. Literally, even today, you can see, publications this year being said that junk DNA is useless and is left over from our, transit from single cell organisms to humans and all this kind of really, backwards philosophy that some of the top labs in the world still have. But the exosome is exuding this microRNA information to change the behavior of cells within our body. So the liver gets injured, it exudes microRNA, or it sees some stressor. Then the brain and other organs can adapt to that stressor that the liver just sent out. Then we can exude that out of our body in exosomes that are encapsulated in our saliva or in our urine. Or in our breath, even with the little droplets there. And so we are exuding genetic information out. And some of those carry full-blown RNA and DNA strands that can code for proteins. And so an RNA, DNA strand coding for, wrapped in a protein sheath that will go out and bind to somebody else's material, that is a virus. That's the same, mechanics, is the same, structures, everything else. And so we definitely are at a point where we need to realize that a genomic communication network is how we live. And we can call them viruses and we can call them exosomes, but both of those are misleading because it sounds like they're different. We need to just admit that viruses are the genomic communication network of the microbiome and the macrobiome. So it's what connects bacteria, fungi, single cell systems to macrocellular systems like trees, humans, animals. And for all of that, we have a unified biology that is diverse, exhibits an immune system function as a population, not as an individual. An individual doesn't have an immune system. If you isolate an individual, they get a massive drop in their protective mechanisms and a huge vulnerability to an imbalanced response to the environment. And so when we see a COVID patient go into the hospital, their risk of death suddenly goes up. If they get put in an ICU bed and isolated away from everybody and put on a respirator, they have 88% likelihood of death. Whereas if you're out in the community, you get exposed to this thing, you've got, maybe a 1 in 1,000 chance of dying.
Given what you say, doesn't this cast, that's really big, this confusion between exosome, not confusion, they're synonymous, exosomes and viruses. This really has massive implications for, the alleged sort of diagnosis of a set of symptoms with a virus that they've dubbed COVID-19. And from what I understand, with the RT-PCR test that they were using in allegedly making this correlation, I understand that they didn't, conform with Koch's postulates, or even Rivers' reversion of Koch's postulates, in the actual proving of causation. And if things like the PCR test are testing for a piece of RNA, a sort of genetic material proxy, if you like, that's associated with these symptoms, my point is, how sure can we be that the PCR test, which is is the root of almost all of these global statistics, can we be sure that it's actually telling us anything useful? I mean, even I just want to quickly add that the inventor of it said it shouldn't be used for diagnostic purposes, and it's alleged to have something like an 80% positive failure rate. I don't know whether you know anything about this, but can we be confident in that test in the light of everything you just said?
The only thing we can be confident in is have a ton of science on is exactly the wrong test to do. Like it's so catastrophically wrong scientifically to do PCR. The reason is because well, there's actually multiple reasons why it can lead you down the wrong path. But an iScience study that actually looked specifically at the COVID-19 PCR found an 80.2% false positive rate, which means that it was only correctly identifying positives 19% of the time. And so that's dumbfoundingly inaccurate. And then it had a 30% false negative, which means 30% of the people that actually had the virus present, it couldn't detect either. And so the reasons why it's so fraught with problems is because coronaviruses are so abundant. We have coronavirus DNA all over the place because it's the common cold. It's, we are constantly seeing shift and drift of the genomics of corona. And so corona has been around since before humankind, I think, but in its current form that we have, we can definitely say it was present in 700 years ago at the time of the bubonic plague. There's some good evidence that may be able to map it back 1,200 years. So suffice it to say, it's been around a long time in its current form, hundreds and hundreds of years. And so when we do PCR, we're magnifying a genetic sequence that's not the entire sequence. We're picking a small protein sequence out of the massive mix of proteins that are in COVID, and then saying that's going to be our positive. There's a number of different flaws with that, in addition to the fact that it's identifying maybe non-COVID proteins. It's also identifying extremely tiny amounts of this stuff. And so PCR is an amplification tool to find tiny little genetic signals and then amplify them. And so when you amplify a signal, you don't know if it's at a high enough level in the bloodstream to even cause a reaction to an immune system or downstream to have any symptoms whatsoever. And so this is why we see an extremely high false positive rate again, is that a tiny bit of virus isn't enough to even mount a clinical response or a clinical deficit from exposure to the gene or the genes that are in that new genetic information from the virus. And so we need to really quickly come to terms with the fact that when you see, I'm used to seeing our regulatory communities mislead people with this information. We've seen this before. I have never seen universities jump on the bandwagon. Johns Hopkins, Harvard, these big universities on their website, Stanford, you go and they say there's this many deaths from COVID-19. That is scientifically the most erroneous thing you could possibly say. And now you're starting to see, a fast backtracking happen. Last weekend in the United States, we saw the CDC downgrade deaths from COVID from 60,000 to 39,000. And they didn't announce that. It was just quietly corrected on their website, and so it's very disturbing how misleading the information has been. We have two events going on. There's a new virus. This happens every year. We always have new viruses in the environment. There's 12,800 or something new viruses, new virus strains that have been detected since 1976. So this is like a weekly, or monthly experience that when science is discovering something new, some new virus that's going either regionally or globally. Every year we have a huge number of deaths from respiratory cause that we don't identify the pathogen. This year we happened to identify a pathogen we called it COVID-19. It has a unique new protein structure from some of the previous ones, but it's behaving just very similar to SARS and MERS and the other coronaviruses that have happened in the last 20 years. And so this is not new genetic information. I think this is old genetic information. And what we're showing is the reason people are dying are, again, you mentioned Koch's postulate. You don't see it at all. A great journal article came out from JAMA Network, Journal of American Medical Association, which I'd never have blamed for being on the cutting edge of truth, but I think they did a great job, maybe by mistake, on this article, which showed the presenting symptoms and laboratory findings of 5,700 patients presenting with COVID syndrome to New York hospitals in the last few weeks. And the entire population as a whole did not even have a fever. They did not have elevation of white blood cell counts. They didn't have any of the features that you would say they're having an infection. Instead, they presented with liver injury and hypoxia. And so it looks like a toxin exposure similar to cyanide, not a virus. And so if you have an infection, you see white blood cells go up, you see triglycerides go up, you see inflammatory markers go up, you see all kinds of signals that are fitting Koch's postulates, which are over 100 years old, 130 years old or something now when Koch laid those out. And so Dr. Koch, when he said that, he was showing that if an infection is going to have, it has to have an inflammatory reaction from the body. We cannot show that with a virus. You can expose somebody to HIV. The only thing that we've ever found with HIV that even remotely fits Koch's postulates was one study that got done in monkeys where they took HIV, put it into monkeys at a very high dose, and they eventually showed downstream complications of the virus that looked nothing like AIDS. And so even with something as well studied and established as HIV, we can't show Koch's postulates, which suggests, again, we have genetic information that's being put into the body and cellular system. You get a response to that. If the body is responding in an unbalanced fashion to that genetic update due to other injuries, i.e. environmental terrain is screwed up, then you can have downstream consequences. And that's what we see with COVID. And Harvard published it for, second. It was really China that figured it out first, is that the micrograms of air pollution that's smaller than 2.5 nanometers, this is a very commonly measured content in air pollution, for every microgram, which is a tiny, tiny little bit, in each cubic meter of air, there was a 20-fold increase in risk of death from COVID, which is far greater risk than the presence of the virus or not. And so what people are dying from is actually air pollution. The virus seems to be potentiating our response to that air pollution. And what we now know is that air pollution can unnaturally congregate the genetic information of this virus into very big clumps where you're getting this abnormal delivery system of genetic information. In addition, we have a situation where there's good studies now showing that ACE inhibitors, or ARBs, which are two classes of blood pressure medications which upregulate the ACE2 receptor in our lungs, increases your risk of death following a COVID exposure. And I think that's how we need to start to categorize these. These are deaths following an exposure to this genetic information. It wasn't death from COVID. COVID looks to be very benign as a genetic update. What's causing the complication is when the environment, i.e. air pollution, or our drugs, ACE inhibitors, and not published yet, but I'm putting into my movie coming out next week, is that statin drugs are also upregulating ACE2 receptors in our lungs. So if you're on an ACE inhibitor and a statin drug, which every diabetic is supposed to be on both of those, every kidney patient is supposed to be on those, every heart disease patient, and of course those are the three leading mortality risk factors of those three conditions. And I don't think it's so much the condition, I think it's the drugs they're on, because we know they upregulate the receptor for the genetic information. So the genetic information is benign, but if we have a diseased, drugified, pharmaceuticalized receptor system, we're going to get an imbalance with that virus or with that genetic information. And so we are showing that our pharmaceutical industry and our transportation and energy sectors are what are killing people. And news brief here, that's what's killing the planet, is our chemical industries that are treating our soils and our humans the same way by destroying all the microbiome, and our transportation and energy sectors that are sucking out carbon molecules and destroying soil systems in the process. So it's not a surprise in the end that we are dying from our own behavior, not of a virus.
It seems from what you're saying then that we've got this ordinary virus, as you say, flu season comes around or the cold season when people's immune systems are more challenged comes around every year, and viruses change. We always have new viruses. So essentially, I'm getting a picture here. We have an ordinary virus, a variant of corona, that seems to be blown out of all proportion. It seems to me that so many sick people, as you've described, people on these drugs, are going to have various reasons to react to this piece of genetic material dubbed COVID-19. And but given then that we've also got these huge exaggerations, doctors being encouraged to put COVID-19 on death certificates, we've got people dying with COVID-19 as dying from that confusion. We've also got the false positive test rate. So when we join all these dots, Dr. Zach, we've got this huge overblown situation that would seem to be a whole bunch of nothing. I mean, obviously there are some people dying out there, but there always are. Regrettably, there are always people dying every day, all around the world. But it seems from what you're saying, they're not really dying of any particular virus. There's nothing out there that we should be scared of. I'm concluding as I join all the dots. There's no reason to be fearful. As you've explained with germ theory, and I'm on board with that. There's no reason to be fearful of being attacked, but maybe the more the fear should be around our lifestyle choices that leave us vulnerable, taking all these drugs, as you say, all the other health insults, poor diet, EMFs, and we could go on with a long list, couldn't we? Are these really the threats that are being detected when a PCR test detect something that could be exosomes, could be some genetic material? There seems to be a lack of clarity there. So it seems that almost everybody could potentially be COVID-19 positive.
Well, we have some pretty good evidence that that's exactly what happened. So coronavirus happened in 2001, 2002, and then was gone from the human experience, not because the genetic information no longer was circulating around the planet. It is and was, but it's no longer, causing an imbalance in the human system because we found genetic homeostasis after 2 years of that. Then 10 years later, a new variant pops up in the form of MERS, which came out of the Middle East, another coronavirus with a new protein structure, everything else. And so we had 2011, 12, or 2 years of that. The first year, obviously, the worst in both cases, then a few more cases the next year, and then gone. There was no vaccine developed for this. In fact, there is no vaccine against RNA viruses that's ever worked. And so we didn't need a vaccine because there was nothing to fight against. There was nothing to protect against. We needed the genetic update because the genetic update was saying there is massive stress in the biologic systems. And I don't care if this was modified in a medical lab or not, corona in all of its shapes or forms are explaining stress signal and appropriate adaptive responses to our environment. What the adaptive response is right now, COVID is screaming at us, is stop polluting the air, stop putting pharmaceutical drugs that imbalance the normal, interaction with your environment. If you stop doing that, you're not going to die at the same rate. It's very telling that CDC tracks respiratory death for years and years, and every week we get that update. This has been the least respiratory deaths that we've seen over the last 7 years. The highest rates of death happened in 2017 from an influenza strain that had a 7% mortality rate. And yet we closed no schools, we closed no economies, we did nothing like that because we knew that wasn't going to affect the virus. The virus is genetic information that spreads around the earth before humans got here. It doesn't take human transmission to get a virus around the earth. That happens naturally through air currents and everything else. And that's been shown in Europe that these viruses can be measured in ice caps and desert scenes where there's no humans at the same rate that it spreads through the human population. And so we have very little effect ultimately on the spread of this genetic information around the planet. That's how the planet has evolved, is a genetic continuum.
If I could just interject there, Dr. Zach, what about the implications there for, is there any reason to shut down the tourist industry? Is lockdown justified, really, when you look at join these dots together? Is it really going to make any difference if these viruses spread around? And what about the fact that some viruses survive for X number of hours on this surface or a bit longer on that surface? What about things like that? Can viruses still go around the planet on the wind given those limitations?
Again, they always tell you half the data and then pretend like they're telling you the whole story. So respiratory droplets, the little liquid that comes out of your breath or spit in the air, those respiratory liquid droplets, they can contain virus, but the virus there can only go about 3 to 4 feet and can only live for a number of days. Aerosolized virus goes up into the atmosphere to the stratosphere. It goes up, up into the above the cloud level. You're almost in the ionosphere there, and then disperses over the globe in the air. It has a very long lifespan when it's not attached to liquid. Liquid water is an oxidator. Water breaks, a World War II ship sinks, and within 60 years, that 40 million tons of steel or 40 million pounds of steel is dissolved. Water is a huge cleanser. It is the ultimate cleaner. So why is the virus gone in 3 days? It's because there's water there that's degrading it through its natural oxidative capacity. And so that's why it's short-lived when it's in a respiratory droplet. But that's not how most of the virus is traveling. And so putting a mask on doesn't make any sense for changing the transit of a virus around a planet. Again, humans are not a big piece of this transit puzzle. And then putting people in isolation makes no sense, because it would suggest that somehow the genetic material just floats around outside or just in schools or something. It's literally evenly dispersed across the planet. And if you look at the COVID cases across the U.S., it's not like it's just New York where everybody's dying and in San Francisco where humans are. It's literally, you can see this steady distribution across the Midwest through our rural environments, everything else. And the number of cases, of course, are lower because the population is lower in those spaces, but it's geographically dispersed. You're going to see hot spots where the environment is most toxic. And so Wuhan province, or Hubei province with Wuhan city in the middle of it, is not surprisingly the most toxic environment of China. And so last year I showed this before the virus. I showed pictures of Roundup spraying in China and showed people where the next epidemic was likely to stem from in Asia, because you can predict it, not because you're smart, but because you just have the Roundup spraying map. You know the microbiome is most damaged in Hubei province compared to everywhere else. Then you overlap the air pollution map. The air pollution map is most dense in south of Beijing, which then overlaps with northern Hubei province. And so you know that you're going to put massive genomic stress and signal on from microbiome damage with Roundup, which is an antibiotic, and then you're going to get that air dispersion and clumping of that virus in density around the air pollution. Hubei province saw a sudden cessation of COVID-related deaths when their air pollution dropped below 40 microns per cubic meter. Suddenly there was no deaths because they weren't dying of air pollution anymore. And so the cyanide and other compounds within the air pollution weren't present at a high enough dose then to be triggered into this hypoxic injury that we've been calling COVID-19. And so it wasn't the isolation of the people away from each other. It was the drop in traffic that allowed for that to happen. And so as a public health official, we should have the simple message of, if we're going to prevent deaths from the next COVID thing, as soon as we measure a COVID strain that's going to potentially be a problem. But I would argue influenza kills way more people than COVID ever have in the last 20 years. We've got 1,000-fold more deaths or something like that from influenza annually than we have from these 3 COVID experiences. And interestingly, I think the numbers are going to be more closely. Worldwide, SARS was only found to affect like 9,000 people. MERS was around 12,000, I think. And so these were low numbers. And I think we're going to see, rapid correction over these next few months as we come to terms with the fact that we over-categorized all of this. Stanford study just came out with a serologic study finally. So, why we've been publishing all this, COVID, stuff by PCR. I don't know what the I know they were political and economic decisions. I don't know who's backing that or what. I think Dr. Fauci has certainly exposed himself, as has the Gates Foundation, as being kind of behind some of the thinking of that and all of that. But nonetheless, I don't think that's terribly important. I think what's more important is, as a population, we have made ourselves so susceptible to the fear story. We need to stop the fear. That's us that's generating the fear. We are responding to BS news with fear instead of critique. And I think that's changing. I think that a lot of people like you, Nigel, are working very hard to present a much more balanced approach to critically thinking about our situation. But we didn't do that fast enough as a population to block the biggest transfer of money that we've ever seen in the history of mankind. We just went through the biggest wealth transfer in history into a few hands. And that's going to keep happening at a more and more extreme rate as we see the fragility of empires and their failing.
Dr. Zach, do you think there's anything in like a reverse placebo effect? You mentioned there's a few points there I'd like to respond to, but particularly on the fear factor, do you think there's a sort of a reverse placebo effect or some sort of effect where because everybody's told to be scared of this virus rather than the usual insults to our health, um, do you think that that could perhaps combined with the stress of being cooped up inside, do you think that could have a significant effect on illness?
Radical effect, and we have great evidence of that. And so one of the studies I'm featuring in this film is a study that looked at cortisol levels and stress levels and then susceptibility to infectious agents. And there's just no question that you degrade your healthy response to the environment when you're in a stress state. And you're putting out obviously all kinds of genetic information when you're in a fear state. And so those exosomes, microRNA, you're literally stressing everybody else around you. So the collective immune system of humanity drops when we induce fear. And so that's what's happened, largely is we have damaged, our response, not just to this, but to influenza. And we've seen all-cause mortality go like that. And they're saying, well, maybe that's all COVID. No, that is fear. We did that through fear, and then fear induces us to separate. And when you isolate individuals, they become more prone to collapse. That's the second law of thermodynamics. It cannot be changed. Second law of thermodynamics governs the physics of our atomic structure. When you isolate any system, it becomes more chaotic. That's the second law of thermodynamics in simpler terms, but basically isolation of it increases entropy is the physics term, but entropy and chaos increases when you isolate an organism. And we know this by the simple penile system. We've known since the beginning of penalty systems that severe isolation of a human is the worst penalty you can give them. And so we reserve isolation as our worst penalty in our prison systems. And if you go into solitary confinement, you are hallucinating and in terror within a few days, no matter what your cognitive capacity is going in. And so that's, I think, what we're doing to humanity right now is we are disconnecting people. Those that are most prone to isolation and loneliness, our elderly, are being most affected. And so we are killing our elderly right now. And worse than that, we are so inducing fear in our practitioners, our doctors and nurses, telling them there's some horrible virus that's super infectious and could kill all of them, that they're treating this as if it's like Ebola or something. And they're isolating these patients, won't go in the rooms. They're communicating through tube systems and all this BS. And I understand that fear is real. When you're in a hospital setting, it can be a fearful thing to be on the front lines and feel like you're doing this, especially when the war machine of propaganda is so on you in that moment. And so we have created a humanitarian crisis of our elderly dying in isolation, without a human touch, without a human voice, without family around. That is humanitarian criminal behavior that I think these fear mongers have created. I think crimes against humanity would be an appropriate stance on the fear propaganda, because it has damaged the human soul in the loneliness that we are dying.
It seems that this, you and I in our first conversation discussed the new health paradigm, and getting away from the treatment of symptoms with drugs. That this whole sort of currently dominant medical paradigm, which is incorrect, germ theory and virus mania and all of this sort of stuff. It's a shame that not only have we got an overblown situation quite dramatically, as you've shown, everything has been exaggerated, blown out of proportion. It seems to me from what you're saying that there is no need to fear this virus, coronavirus, if we were to focus on our the usual lifestyle choices that we should to promote gut health and avoid the drugs that you mentioned. And if we took sensible steps to ensure that we're healthy living, we really haven't got anything to worry about with any coronavirus. Would you say that's true?
I would say of any pathogen, like your risk of pneumonia goes down when you're in a healthy environment, when you're connected to nature. And so what we should have done as soon as this thing started was to identify the pharmaceuticals that are putting people at risk, have their doctors transition them off those pharmaceuticals. There's other blood pressure medicines they could be on if they really needed the medicine. Put them on a calcium channel blocker, get them off the ACE inhibitor, ARB, stop the statin drug for 6 months while this thing goes past. And then get them outside. Tell everybody to be at the beach. Tell everybody to be at the parks. Tell everybody to be outside. and get them connected, and tell everybody that they are mandated not to drive in the municipal systems. And so if you're in a city, you have to use a bike, skateboard, or the train system to get around, and let the air pollution correct itself, and then quickly move towards an agricultural system that's not abusing the soils and creating these viruses to begin with. And so it's a very simple algorithm, and we did the opposite, and we have been doing the opposite for 120 years of germ theory. We need to stop seeing nature as our enemy, and we need to embrace it and integrate, and we will see immune system function on a three-dimensional level rather than this two-dimensional human belief system.
So also, just to tie in some of the other alternative things, remedies that have been touted by various people on the internet, such as colloidal silver, hydrogen peroxide, you mentioned briefly earlier, are all of these, when they're considered as a something to tackle the coronavirus, that they're red herrings, aren't they? I mean, I'm getting from you that if we just naturally focus on our health, I'm going to guess that you're going to say we might not necessarily need colloidal silver or hydrogen peroxide, notwithstanding that they may have some merit. Do those things have any merit? Do they have any impact on our gut health? And is it at the end of the day, would the message just be, well, there's no point if we focus on our health, as we've already discussed?
In prevention, just focus on the health, everything we've talked about. Get off the pharmaceuticals. There's good evidence, published in 2017, that if you get the influenza vaccine, your risk of coronavirus goes up. And so we should have announced that in November. We should have said, okay, no flu vaccines this year, because it looks like at that time we thought that it was 30 times or 300 times more deadly than influenza. So we should have stopped all influenza vaccines at that moment and said, okay, never mind on that. We've got a bigger problem, it looks like. And then within a month, we would have found out we didn't really have a problem, and we could have corrected that, and maybe people got flu vaccine or not. I've never been a fan. I don't think there's any evidence of it, because, again, vaccines against virus, very poor track record, and influenza is a great example of that. But nonetheless, we should have, stopped that behavior. We should have stopped the pharmaceutical behavior. We should have cleaned up the air. So from a preventive state, it's changed the train. From a treatment standpoint, that's where you come into a situation where these things can be useful. So now you have a patient that, despite their best efforts, are living in New York City or living in Hubei province, and they now are sick. And so now you have a sick patient. Now colloidal silver, and I would say, is second to zinc. Zinc is definitely your best element. Zinc binds to the protein surface of the virus. It decreased binding to IL-2 and other receptors. And so it's a magic bullet. And so as far as, slowing the replication of the virus down, where you've created an environment where the replication goes up. And so slow down the replication to a nice balanced relationship that would typically be there with zinc. So zinc, number one. The concept of cleaning up with hydrogen peroxide, which is vitamin C. Vitamin C is just a delivering agent for hydrogen peroxide. So high-dose vitamin C works really nicely in the hospital systems. A lot of good data now coming out from doctors who have intrepidly said the government is giving us absolutely no options. We're going to try vitamin C. Very low dose, actually, intravenous vitamin C, like 1.7 grams, which is, for cancer, we usually treat like 25 grams. So a low dose IV vitamin C in the hospital system seems to work pretty well. But what you're treating at that point is not to kill the virus. You're actually decreasing the likelihood of secondary bacterial infections in the hospital. People are dying from secondary bacterial pneumonias, not from COVID, related, lung injury. And so your vitamin C therapies are really there to kind of try to slow down the disequilibrium that's been created by the change of terrain, by this hypoxic injury that's happening from the combination of drugs, air pollution, and some sort of viral trigger that's making us more vulnerable to those things. And so that is, the matrix. So when we think about colloidal silvers, anything else you're really reading on the internet, is more in that treatment modality rather than a prevention modality.
What about the link between the frequencies of 60 gigahertz, which are believably the oxygen molecule has an energy absorption spike at around about that frequency? Do you think there's any possibility that there could be any implications for EMFs associated with the symptoms of not being short of breath, looking blue, people dropping, collapsing suddenly, as if by through suffocation? Do you think there's any possible connection there between that and these symptoms of COVID-19?
There's some nice scientific, publications that have been done on disruption of oxygen carrying capacity of the bloodstream with 5G radiation and other forms of 1 millimeter or smaller microwave radiation. So that stuff's well established. But the issue there, and we can't just go and say this is 5G because first of all, SARS happened, in 2001, 2002 before we had 3G. And so it presented the same way with blue patients that would then have their lungs fill with fluid and then ultimately die from secondary pneumonias. And so this has been going on for 20 years. So we can't blame it on 5G. Does 5G further weaken the organism? Yeah, certainly it does. Every time we irradiate a piece of food with a microwave or irradiate a human body with any man-made frequency, we disrupt it. And it's starting to get very concerning with 5G because now, like you mentioned, we're down in cellular absorption wavelengths, whereas 4G was above that cellular frequency. And so I have grave concerns over 5G, but I have equally as grave concerns over my colleagues who are running around saying this is because of 5G, because the science doesn't hold up, which is going to weaken our case as to why we need to stop 5G. My main concern around 5G happens to not even be in the microbiome. My concern around 5G is the erosion of civil liberties. It's our privacy that's being taken away there, not just our biology. So as a peoples, we need to be very concerned about the ownership of all of our life, and that's happening through advertising, which is being empowered by the Internet of Things, and that's why they're rolling out 5G. And so, I think that, we have much bigger problems to fry with 5G. And so I'm very concerned that we're putting out all this kind of almost conspiracy level partial science and then blaming COVID for that. And that's just not right. The science doesn't bear up. The history doesn't bear up. And so 5G problem, probably massive problem on multiple socioeconomic, political, blah, 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 all the way down to the biology. Yes, problems. But I just warn my colleagues that are out there pounding the pavement, giving these little 10-minute videos online saying that 5G is killing us. Well, maybe so, but if we're saying the wrong thing, then those that are trying to suppress any truth are going to have a heyday with these partial science claims, and so it's very dangerous for us to do that.
Okay, well, thank you for giving us your views on that. Um, One more point, vaccines. So, given what you've said over the last 50 minutes, and I'm aware of your time, so I won't keep you too much longer, Dr. Zach. But if you said vaccines have an appallingly bad track record with viruses, and many listeners might appreciate that the annual flu vaccine is a sort of a guess at the latest mutation of the virus anyway. Um, you mentioned that the good luck with them finding it. Do you think there is any realistic chance of finding an effective vaccine? And what of the implications of, given the way this whole saga has been blown out of all proportion, and we're even hearing talk of mandatory vaccinations, given that we know that there's good evidence they're not the most efficacious way towards any kind of immunization. What are your thoughts on vaccination being pushed as the solution to this sort of alleged problem and this claim of pandemic?
They should have picked a different virus. If that's really their mission, and it sounds like it is. Dr. Fauci and Gates Foundation have come straight out to say that this is their mission to have mandatory vaccines and have methodology to track who's been vaccinated and not, and all this. They've flat out said it now. That was kind of in the realm of conspiracy theory the last few years, but this has been interesting for them to just come right out on international television and say, this is when you're going to be allowed to go back to normal, is once you've gotten this vaccine, and we're going to keep track of who's getting this vaccine through some very, invasive technologies of nanotech and all of that. And so, wow, okay, so that's the agenda. You should have picked a different virus because this thing in the last 20 years has disappeared on its own within 2 years. And so you're saying that you're going to roll out, as they just did, over 100 million vaccine doses by early 2021. Well, we're going to be done with the virus by then. Like, you literally are going to vaccinate something that's already has herd immunity, if you want to believe that we have to be immune against genetic information, which I don't even believe. But you picked the wrong virus. You should have done something like flu, or you should have done something that at least sounds like it's always in our environment and is a threat. You should have done HIV. I don't know. You should have picked a different virus, but please, public, let's not be hoodwinked into thinking we need a mandatory vaccine against something, an RNA virus that we've never been able to vaccinate against, that's already gone. Like, it's not going to be ever a threat again. Some other version of corona, Sure, it could either be adapted by nature or by humans to be a military problem or whatever, but it's not now. And that whatever vaccine they developed in the next few months that they then mass produce in January is not going to be safety tested, and certainly isn't going to be efficacy tested, because there's no efficacy to test against, because you don't have a population that hasn't been exposed to the virus already. The world will be exposed to this virus over the next few months, and it will be gone. Or better said, it's not gone. It's now in a homeostatic, it's in a balance with human biology, and therefore we don't need to be immune to it, because we've all seen it and genetically responded to it, and we're now part of it. We're exuding that exosome, viral information out in there. We're the source of it already. It's not nature, it's us. We're producing this thing. We now need to find our balance and homeostatic with this new genetic information. And if you now take a virus and you disrupt that relationship between us and whatever element of the global immune system we fit and that reaction, you're going to screw us up for other things. Again, the study in 2017 showing that if you get a flu vaccine, you have increased risk of not just coronavirus, but multiple other species, has been worked out very well. There's a whole science around the fact that if you get a native reaction to new viral information, you become genetically balanced with other species, not just that virus. Your genomic, balance, it could be called immunity, but it's not. You're not attacking those things and developing, a serologic immunity against it. When you see antibodies against a virus, you're actually seeing antibodies against proteins that your body produced in reaction to the virus. You're not even seeing the virus. That's why we can't make a vaccine against the viruses. The antibodies aren't even designed to attack the virus as it comes into the system. It's designed to attack cells that have now generated the proteins and the exosomal information that it's now exuding. And it's now cleaning those up so that it finds a balance of the right number of cells in the right tissues of your body to have that new genetic information. It is very important as a closing statement to realize that 50% of the human genome so far has been mapped back to viral source. Our genes are from viruses. We would not be mammals, let alone humans, if we had not gotten the genetic updates of the last billion years to become the genome that we are. Even within that, massive population of nucleotide sequences from the virome, it's amazing to realize that 10% of our genome is from retroviruses like HIV. And so we have the wrong identity. We think we're human. We are the culmination of viral intelligence and viral trial and error over 1 billion years. And that's who we are. We are one of the magnum opuses of biology, perhaps. And in our, creative consciousness, we've put ourselves against the very biology that created us.
Well, thank you so much for that, Dr. Zach. Wonderful, addition to our education that you've shared with us thus far. Fantastic perspective. It seems to me like there's never been a better time to be into health, to be aware of our need to re-examine all our lifestyle choices and the drugs that we may be on and our microbiome diversity. It's a really good time to take an interest in health, isn't it? So where can listeners contact you, Dr. Zach, for any more information on your product and your message?
The education mission is on zachbushmd.com. You can find there's a Corona statement on there that kind of goes into some more detail on kind of my perspective on Corona, as well as the supplements that are out there, both that we produce in our labs as well as others around the world that we've been encouraging people to use, and for more of that kind of prophylactic or protective mechanism prevention, as well as some that are more targeted herbal compounds that are more targeted at treatment kind of concepts around the inflammatory cascade itself. So, you can go there, find out more. I'd encourage you to look up beyond Corona there. Like I've got, sections on pregnancy all the way to kind of autoimmunity and where all these conditions can be supported by the microbiome and all of that. So zachbushmd.com, more on soil science and how the soil is impacting human gut health. ionbiome.com is where you can find that whole soil system for support of sinus health, gut health, brain health, and beyond. And then you can go to farmersfootprint.us. We would much appreciate your support there. It's a nonprofit that all of our funds are going to support other root cause solutions for the planet, and they include Farmers Footprint, where we're teaching awareness and other strategies for both consumer and farmers to transition their households, their communities, and their farms away from glyphosate. And so check that out. Non-Toxic Neighborhoods is one of our latest projects with Kim Conti at the head of that, a concerned mother who's put together an extraordinary toolkit for cities and municipalities to ban Roundup and use organic control methods instead. And so that toolkit's available. You can link through the farmersfootprint.us or go to nontoxicneighborhoods.org. Over 60 cities and counties around the U.S. are underway. 30 of them are completely banned now. For that's cleaned up thousands and thousands of acres of city parks and school systems so that our children aren't rolling around in this stuff. And so it's a very exciting toolkit I'd encourage all of you to go there and become activists within your community with that toolkit to really change your risk as a community.
And what of your film that you mentioned was coming out very shortly?
Yeah, you'll be able to access that for free. I'll be streaming that on YouTube, and you can access that through the Zach Bush MD website as well. But we'll be getting after it in broad ways. We'll send you links as well, Nigel. Make sure you can distribute that to your community as well. So we'll get that all out to everybody. It'll be an important, I think, piece for everything from consumers looking at how we need to change science, not just our response to this virus. We need to change science. Because there's 30 years of great science that has shown us there's a different world, and we're not living in it yet, and we need to move to that world quickly. So it's an expose on a paradigm shift that we need to make. And this issue of the virus and mandates on vaccination, it's a tiny piece of the problem at hand. We need to actually change, fundamentals around how research is funded. We need to change the way in which universities interact with taxpayer dollars to create intellectual property and then, sequester that information away from taxpayers. So if we're going to fund our universities, we need access to that knowledge that we are funding, and we need to create change there. So it's a multifactorial transformation that's needed, and we have to do that within the next 8 to 10 years to fundamentally change our consumer behavior, consumer lifestyle, so that it's in line with nature and not opposed to it.
Yep. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Bush, for all of that information. It's been a great pleasure once again, and thank you for taking the time. And thank you, everybody, for listening. I do hope you got some value from this amazing education coming from Dr. Zach. And do join us again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see.